The letter showed up on a Thursday morning, right in the middle of the worst cold snap our neighborhood had seen in 11 years. I remember that detail precisely because I was standing at my front window watching the thermometer on my porch railing red 7 degrees Fahrenheit when I spotted the familiar cream-colored envelope tucked inside my mailbox. You know the one. Every homeowner in Pinecrest Meadows knows that envelope. Official HOA letterhead. Marlene Chambers' name printed in the return address corner like she was running a small country, instead of a subdivision of 62 houses in suburban Minnesota. I pulled on my boots, trudged through the knee-deep snow that had accumulated along my driveway, grabbed the envelope and went back inside. I poured myself another cup of coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and opened it up. I figured it was the usual noise. Something about my garbage cans being visible from the street for 3 extra hours on collection day. Or maybe a complaint that my Christmas lights weren't the approved style listed in the HOA's 47-page aesthetic guidelines document, which I promise you is a real document that exists in a binder on Marlene Chambers' kitchen counter, probably organized by color-coded tabs. What I read instead made me set my coffee cup down very slowly, the way you do when you need a moment to make sure your brain is processing information correctly. The letter informed me, in formal language that sounded like it had been drafted by a lawyer who'd never actually practiced law, that the HOA Board of Directors for Pinecrest Meadows had passed a new resolution at the November general meeting, a meeting I had not been informed about, by the way, banning all snow fences on private property within the community. Effective immediately. Any snow fence currently installed must be removed within 10 business days. Failure to comply would result in daily fines of $50 per day until the fence was removed, plus a $100 administrative fee for the initial violation notice. The letter cited, and I'm quoting here directly, Aesthetic Coherence Policy 7.4b, which prohibits the installation or display of industrial-appearing structures, equipment, or materials visible from any common area or neighboring property. Snow fences. They banned snow fences. In Minnesota. In January. I actually laughed out loud when I read it the second time, because part of me assumed I was misunderstanding something. Snow fences, for anyone who doesn't live somewhere that gets buried under several feet of snow every winter, are those lightweight wooden or plastic slatted fences you put up on your property to control where snow drifts. They redirect wind so that drifting snow deposits somewhere useful rather than, say, filling your entire driveway with a 4-foot wall of packed powder overnight. They are not decorative. They are not permanent. They are purely functional tools that people in cold climates use, so they don't have to spend 2 hours every morning digging out before they can get to work. I had installed one along the north edge of my property back in October when I first moved in, specifically because I noticed during my house hunting visits that the open field adjacent to that side of the neighborhood created a wind corridor that pushed snow directly onto the properties on my block. My driveway, without the fence, would have become essentially impassable every time we got more than a few inches of snow. My neighbor across the street, a retired contractor named Frank Dobbins, had warned me about it the first week I moved in. He'd been fighting the same problem for years. I owned that snow fence. It sat entirely on my private property. It wasn't near the street. It wasn't blocking anyone's view of anything worth looking at, mostly just the back corner of my yard where the property met a small drainage easement. I had put it up entirely within what I understood to be my rights as a property owner. But Marlene Chambers had other ideas. Let me back up and tell you about Marlene Chambers, because you need the full picture to appreciate everything that followed. Marlene had been on the Pinecrest Meadows HOA board for 6 consecutive years, which in HOA terms is roughly equivalent to running a small fiefdom. She'd been the board president for the last 3 of those years. She was meticulous, she was territorial, and she had the particular energy of someone who had found the one arena of life where she held genuine authority and was going to squeeze every last drop of power out of it. She drove a white Lexus SUV with a personalized license plate that I'm not going to repeat here because it's too on the nose. She wore a real estate agent blazer basically every time I saw her outdoors, even when she was just checking her mail. She had organized the neighborhood Christmas decoration contest 3 years running and had won it all 3 times, which should tell you something about the neutrality of the judging process. Her lawn was perfect in the summer, her driveway was shoveled within minutes of any snowfall, and she had once filed a formal complaint against the Kowalski family at number 18 because their basketball hoop was 2 inches taller than the HOA's approved height limit for recreational equipment. 2 inches. She lived 4 houses down from me on the same side of the street, which meant she walked past my property at least once a day on what I had come to understand was essentially a surveillance route. I found out later, much later, that the snow fence ban had been Marlene's idea from the beginning. She'd raised it at the November board meeting, framing it as a community aesthetics issue. Apparently someone on the adjacent street had installed a large orange plastic snow fence along their fence line, and Marlene had decided that it looked like something you'd see at a construction site. From there, she'd taken the concept and run with it, because that's what Marlene did. She escalated. She generalized. She turned a specific irritation into a sweeping policy that affected everyone. The problem was that most of the other board members just went along with whatever Marlene proposed, either because they agreed with her, or because they were tired of arguing, or because Marlene had a way of making the path of least resistance look extremely attractive. The resolution passed 4-1. The one dissenting vote came from a board member named Gary Schultz, a quiet guy who lived at the end of the cul-de-sac, and who apparently said during the meeting that banning snow fences in Minnesota in winter was, quote, genuinely insane. Marlene had reportedly responded that Gary was not seeing the big picture. I found all of this out from Frank Dobbins, who had been at the meeting, because Frank was one of those neighbors who actually attended HOA meetings and paid attention. He came over to my house the same afternoon I got my letter, stomping the snow off his boots on my porch before I even opened the door. "You got the letter," he said. It wasn't a question. "I got the letter," I confirmed. He came inside, accepted the coffee I offered, and gave me the full rundown. He also told me that he had received the same letter because he also had a snow fence on his property. So had 6 other homeowners on our block, all of whom had installed fences for the same reason I had. The wind corridor from that open field was notorious. Frank had been fighting that drifting problem for 12 years and had finally solved it with a fence. Now Marlene wanted him to tear it out in the middle of winter. "She can't actually do this, can she?" I asked. Frank gave me the long, complicated shrug of a man who had dealt with HOA boards for over a decade. "Technically, they can pass whatever they want," he said. "Whether it holds up legally is a different question." That was the key phrase, whether it holds up legally. I spent that evening at my kitchen table with my laptop open, reading through my HOA's CC and RS, which stands for Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, the foundational legal document that governs what the HOA can and can't do. I read it carefully. I took notes. I cross-referenced it with Minnesota state law regarding HOA governance, which I found through a combination of the Minnesota Statute's website and a few helpful legal forums where property law attorneys occasionally posted useful guidance. What I found was genuinely interesting. The CC and RS for Pinecrest Meadows did give the board authority to regulate permanent structures and aesthetic elements visible from common areas. But snow fences, by their very nature, are temporary seasonal installations. They are not structures. They are not permanent. They are literally removed every spring. There was also a clause in the CC and RS stating that any new rule or amendment to existing policy required a 30-day notice to all homeowners before it could take effect, along with an opportunity for homeowners to attend a meeting where the change would be discussed. The November meeting where the snow fence ban had been passed, I had received zero notice. Not a letter, not an email, not a note on the community bulletin board, nothing. Neither had Frank. Neither had any of the other 7 homeowners I spoke to over the next 2 days who had also received violation letters. So right out of the gate, the process by which this rule had been passed was procedurally flawed. The 30-day notice requirement hadn't been met. The rule was potentially unenforceable for that reason alone, before we even got into the substantive question of whether the HOA had the authority to ban temporary seasonal equipment from private property. I kept my snow fence up. The next morning, when Marlene drove past my house on her way back from wherever Marlene went in the early morning hours, possibly to survey her domain, I watched from my front window as she slowed her Lexus to a crawl, looked pointedly at my snow fence, and then continued down the street. I could practically see the gears turning. 2 days later, I got a follow-up notice. This one was hand-delivered, tucked under my windshield wiper, which meant Marlene had walked up my driveway and put it there herself. It informed me that the 10-day compliance window was counting down and that fines would begin accruing on day 11. I took a photo of that notice on my windshield and noted the date and time. Meanwhile, the weather was doing what Minnesota weather does in January, which is make you question every life decision that led you to live in a place where the wind chill regularly hits 20 below. We got 8 more inches of snow over 4 days, with another storm system forecasted. My snow fence was doing exactly what snow fences are supposed to do, directing the drift away from my driveway and toward the corner of my yard where it could pile up harmlessly. Without it, based on what Frank described from his pre-fence years, I would have been looking at a drift 3 to 4 feet high across the entire width of my driveway by morning after each significant snowfall. I want you to picture what it would mean to remove that fence. In practice, removing it during a January storm cycle would mean spending an additional hour or more every single morning digging out my driveway just to get to work. It would mean potentially not being able to get out at all on heavy snow days. It would mean real material harm to my ability to function as a normal human being in winter. And all because the fences looked, in Marlene Chambers' professional aesthetic opinion, too industrial. At this point, I decided to do a few things simultaneously. First, I drafted a formal written response to the HOA board, citing the procedural violation regarding the 30-day notice requirement, the clause in the CC and RS that limited HOA authority to permanent structures, and the basic fact that snow fences are temporary seasonal equipment and not structures under any reasonable definition of the term. I sent this to every board member by certified mail, so I had a delivery receipt for each one. I also sent a copy to the HOA's property management company, Lakewood Community Management, which technically oversaw the board's administrative functions. Second, I reached out to the other 7 homeowners who had received violation letters. I set up a group text, which felt very 21st century for a dispute that essentially dated back to when settlers were building dugouts on the prairie, and got everyone coordinated. Frank Dobbins was the obvious leader of this group, both because he'd been around the longest and because he had a calm, methodical way of approaching things that kept everyone from just venting and accomplishing nothing. Third, I started keeping meticulous records. Every piece of correspondence got scanned and dated. Every interaction got noted. I installed a doorbell camera that covered my front walkway and driveway, partly because I'd been meaning to do it anyway, and partly because something told me I was going to want video documentation of whatever came next. That turned out to be a very good decision. About a week after I sent the formal response, nothing had changed from the board's end. No acknowledgement of my procedural objection, No response to my legal citations, nothing. The 10-day window expired. The fines were supposedly now accruing. And then one Saturday morning, I was inside eating breakfast and watching the snow come down. Another 6 inches forecasted for that day when my doorbell camera sent an alert to my phone. I picked it up and watched the live feed. Marlene Chambers was standing at the edge of my property on the public sidewalk with her phone out taking photographs of my snow fence. I let her finish, then opened my front door. "Good morning, Marlene," I called out. She startled, which was satisfying, and then composed herself with visible effort. "Brian, I'm documenting your violation for the HOA's records." "Great," I said pleasantly. "I'm documenting your documentation for my records." I held up my phone so she could see it, indicating the camera app. She looked at the doorbell camera, then back at me, and her expression shifted slightly. "The fines are accruing, Brian, $50 a day. This is going to get expensive." "I look forward to discussing that in court," I said, still cheerful, still pleasant. "Have a nice day. Watch out for the ice on the sidewalk. It's nasty out here." I closed the door. I immediately called Frank. He laughed for about 30 seconds straight when I told him about the exchange. Over the next week, the group text was busy. One homeowner, a woman named Patricia Olson who worked as a paralegal and lived 2 doors down from me, had done her own research and confirmed everything I'd found about the procedural defect. She went further and found a Minnesota appellate court case from 2019 that had ruled against an HOA's enforcement of a rule that hadn't followed proper notice procedures. She typed out a summary and posted it to the group. The consensus became clear. We were not removing the fences, we were not paying the fines, and if the HOA wanted to push this, we were going to push back with everything we had. Frank also raised something at our first in-person meeting, which we held at his house because it was the biggest kitchen, and which felt slightly conspiratorial and mostly entertaining. A gathering of 8 neighbors drinking coffee and hot chocolate around a kitchen table covered in printed HOA documents. "Has anyone else noticed," Frank said, setting his mug down, "that Marlene's property doesn't have any snow fences and never has?" Nobody had noticed particularly, but it was easy enough to verify just by thinking about the properties in question. Marlene's lot was different from ours in one key respect. It was on the south side of the street, protected from the prevailing wind by the houses and trees to the north. The wind corridor from the open field hit the north side of the street hardest, which was where most of us with snow fences lived. Marlene had never needed a snow fence because her lot's natural positioning protected her from drifting. She had passed a rule eliminating something that disproportionately affected people on the opposite side of the street from her, without any apparent understanding of why they'd installed the fences in the first place. Whether she genuinely didn't understand this or simply didn't care was a question we debated for a while without reaching a firm conclusion. Patricia had another angle. She had pulled the minutes from the last 3 years of HOA board meetings, which were technically supposed to be available to all homeowners, but which the board had never actually distributed. She'd had to formally request them in writing, citing the CC and RS, transparency requirements, and eventually Lakewood Community Management had emailed them over. Patricia spent 2 evenings going through them and reported back with a few interesting findings. First, the November meeting where the snow fence ban had been passed had been a special session, not a regular general meeting. Under the CC and RS, special sessions required 7 days written notice to all homeowners. No notice had been sent. This was a second procedural violation, layered on top of the first. Second, the minutes showed that the vote had been 4-1, with Gary Schultz dissenting. But they also showed that one of the 4 votes in favor had come from a board member named Diane Hopper, who had participated in the meeting by phone rather than in person. The CC and RS required all voting board members to be physically present at the meeting location for votes to count. Diane's phone vote was potentially invalid, which would have changed the outcome to 3-2, which was still a majority. But the invalid procedural steps compounding on each other were building a picture of a board that had rushed this through in a way that didn't follow its own rules. Third, and most interesting, the minutes referenced a discussion prior to the snow fence vote in which Marlene had described her personal aesthetic objections in detail. She had apparently said, verbatim according to the minutes, that this type of fencing makes the neighborhood look like a construction zone or an industrial park, and it reflects poorly on property values, including my own. The inclusion of her own property values as a stated reason was notable. Marlene had a personal financial interest in maintaining what she perceived as neighborhood aesthetics, and she had used her board position to impose her preferences on others in a way that she personally benefited from, at least in theory. That's not automatically illegal, but it's not a great look, and it added to the narrative. Around this time, I had a separate conversation with Gary Schultz, the one dissenting board member. I ran into him at the gas station near the neighborhood entrance, both of us filling up and stamping our feet against the cold, one of those involuntary winter bonds you form with strangers in parking lots when it's 10 below. I introduced myself, mentioned the fence situation, and he immediately relaxed and started talking. I told them it was going to cause problems, he said, watching the fuel pump tick upward. You can't ban snow fences in January, in Minnesota. It's ridiculous. These people actually need them. Why did the rest of the board go along with it? I asked. Gary shrugged, looking tired. Because Marlene gets what Marlene wants. She's been on that board longer than anyone. She knows how to frame things so that disagreeing with her sounds like you don't care about the community. It's a whole thing. Would you be willing to put that in writing? I asked. Not about Marlene specifically, but about the board's process, the lack of notice, the special session issues. He thought about it for a moment. Yeah, he said finally. Yeah, I think I would. I voted against it. I said it was wrong. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. We exchanged numbers. Gary turned out to be one of the most straightforward, genuinely decent people I'd met in the neighborhood, and the fact that he'd been outvoted 4-1, and then been essentially ignored by Marlene for the subsequent weeks had left him pretty fed up. February hit, and it hit hard. The storm system that had been building since late January rolled in over a weekend and dropped 22 inches in roughly 40 hours. I am not exaggerating. 22 inches. The kind of snowfall that makes the news, that schools close for, that turns your street into a silent, white, apocalyptic landscape that's actually kind of beautiful if you don't have anywhere to be. I did have somewhere to be. I had to get to work Monday morning. Without my snow fence, I would have been buried. With it, I had the drift situation under control enough that 90 minutes of shoveling got my driveway cleared. Frank, who had also kept his fence up, was in similar shape. The two homeowners on our block who had, under pressure and anxiety about the fines, removed their snow fences were in considerably worse shape. One of them, a young couple named the Petersons, had a drift across their driveway that was, and I measured it when I walked over to help them, 4 feet and 3 inches at its highest point. It took 3 of us, me, Frank, and their next-door neighbor Kevin, 2.5 hours to dig them out. The Petersons had a newborn, 3 months old, and they'd needed to get to a pediatrician appointment that Monday morning. We made it happen, but it was not a fun 2.5 hours at 15 degrees with wind. I took photographs of the drift before we started digging. I photographed the Petersons' driveway in its buried state and documented it. That same weekend, something else happened that I only found out about later through the neighborhood grapevine, which in Pinecrest Meadows was extensive and efficient. On Saturday, at the height of the storm, when visibility was near zero and nobody sane was out driving, Marlene Chambers had apparently gotten into her Lexus and attempted to drive around the neighborhood to document which homeowners still had snow fences up. She had gotten about 3 blocks from her house before sliding on the ice on Birchwood Lane, the street that curved down a slight hill, and had put her Lexus gently but definitively into the snowbank on the right side of the road. Nobody was hurt. The car sustained no real damage, but she had needed to call a tow truck in the middle of a blizzard, and the tow truck had taken 3 hours to arrive, and she had sat in her car in the snowbank for those 3 hours. Several neighbors had seen her sitting there. Several of those neighbors had offered help and been declined, apparently because Marlene did not want to be seen accepting assistance in this particular situation. I found this out from Patricia, who had heard it from Kevin, who had heard it from the tow truck driver's assistant, who apparently lived one street over. Neighborhood grapevine. Works every time. What struck me about the Marlene and Snowbank story wasn't the mild schadenfreude of it, though yes, I'm human and I felt some. What struck me was the behavior itself. She had gone out in a blizzard to surveil her neighbors. She had not gone to help anyone, not to check on elderly residents, not to offer assistance, not for any community-minded purpose. She had gone to gather violation evidence during a major storm, while her neighbors were struggling. That told me something about her priorities that I filed away. Meanwhile, our group of 8 had been corresponding with a property law attorney in Minneapolis named Rebecca Townsend, whom Patricia had found through her paralegal network. Rebecca had agreed to review our situation for a consultation fee that we split 8 ways, making it extremely reasonable. Her assessment was exactly what we'd hoped. The snow fence ban, as enacted, was procedurally defective on at least 2 independent grounds: the missing homeowner notice and the invalid phone vote potentially invalidating the majority needed for passage. She also opined that even if the procedure had been followed, the substantive question of whether the HOA's authority extended to temporary seasonal equipment on private property was genuinely uncertain and would likely require a court to resolve. Her recommendation was to send a formal demand letter to the HOA board, through her as our attorney, demanding that the snow fence ban be suspended pending a properly noticed community vote, that all fines assessed under the ban be voided, and that the board acknowledge the procedural defects in writing. If they refused, she would file for an injunction. The demand letter went out on a Tuesday, certified mail, to every board member and to Lakewood Community Management. It was 7 pages long, referenced specific CC and R provisions and state statutes, cited the 2019 appellate case, and attached Gary Schultz's written statement about the board's process. It was thorough, professional, and extremely difficult to ignore. 3 days passed. Nothing. Then Marlene made a move that I did not anticipate, and that, looking back, was the moment things shifted from a procedural dispute to something more serious. Frank Dobbins called me on a Thursday evening, and he sounded genuinely angry, which was unusual for Frank. He told me that he had received a certified letter that day from the HOA's attorney, a different attorney than Rebecca, a firm that Lakewood apparently kept on retainer. The letter informed Frank that the HOA was pursuing enforcement of the snow fence violation fine, currently at $50 times 19 days for a total of $950 plus the $100 administrative fee. It further stated that the HOA intended to place a lien on Frank's property if the fine was not paid within 30 days. A lien on Frank's house for a snow fence. Frank was 63 years old, retired, and his house was paid off. A lien on his property was not a casual inconvenience. It was a serious legal encumbrance that could affect his ability to refinance, sell, or do anything requiring a clean title. And it was happening because he had a snow fence in the corner of his yard. I checked my mail and found an identical letter. So did Patricia. So did the other 5 members of our group who had kept their fences up. This changed the calculation significantly. Rebecca Townsend, when I called her that evening, agreed. "They're escalating," she said. "This is a pressure tactic. They're hoping that the threat of a lien will shake loose compliance before this gets to a hearing." "Can they actually put a lien on our properties?" I asked. "They have the mechanism to do it," she said. "Most HOA agreements include lien authority for unpaid assessments." Whether a court would uphold those liens, given the procedural defects we've documented, is a different question. But the lien can be recorded before it's contested, which causes real harm. So what do? We file for the injunction, she said. Now, not later. We ask the court to enjoin the HOA from recording any liens pending resolution of the underlying procedural dispute. We have strong grounds. We authorized her to file. The injunction request went to the Hennepin County District Court the following Monday. By Wednesday, we had a hearing date, 2 weeks out. Now, I have to give credit where it's due. Rebecca was excellent. She built the injunction request around 2 main arguments. First, the irreparable harm argument, that recording liens against our properties during the pendency of the dispute would cause concrete, immediate harm that couldn't easily be undone. Second, the likelihood of success argument, that we had a strong case on the merits because of the procedural defects, meaning a court was likely to ultimately side with us, and therefore the temporary harm of enforcing the rule in the meantime wasn't justified. The HOA's attorney, a guy named Brent something, showed up at the hearing and made what I can only describe as a game effort to defend the indefensible. He argued that the HOA board had broad authority to regulate aesthetics under the CC and RS, that fences were structures, and that homeowners had agreed to the HOA's authority when they purchased their properties. The judge, a calm, methodical woman named Judge Patricia Hernandez, who had clearly been sitting through this type of dispute for years and had approximately zero patience for nonsense, asked the HOA's attorney one simple question. Where is the documentation of the 30-day homeowner notice required under Section 4.7 of the CC and RS before implementation of new rules? Brent something paused, shuffled papers. The board felt that, given the aesthetic urgency of the issue. I didn't ask about urgency, Judge Hernandez said. I asked for the documentation. There was no documentation because it didn't exist. The notice hadn't been sent. The judge granted the injunction. The HOA was enjoined from recording any liens and enjoined from enforcing the snow fence ban pending a full hearing on the merits, which she scheduled for 6 weeks out. We walked out of that courthouse into a gray February afternoon that felt, despite the cold, genuinely warm. But Marlene was not done. I want to stress that, because this is where the story stops being just a neighborhood dispute and becomes something more significant. The day after the injunction hearing, I got home from work to find that someone had tampered with my snow fence. Not removed it entirely, but several of the stakes had been pulled partially out, and the fence was sagging in 2 places. It wasn't storm damage. We hadn't had significant wind in days. The stakes had been manually pulled and then pushed back in crookedly, as if someone had started pulling them and then either been interrupted or decided not to finish the job. I checked my doorbell camera footage. At 2:14 in the afternoon, while I was at work, a figure in a heavy winter coat, dark wool hat, and gloves had walked up the side of my property along the fence line and systematically pulled at several stakes. The figure's face wasn't visible because of the hat and the angle, but the coat was distinctive. Light gray with a dark navy stripe on the sleeve, belted at the waist, the kind of coat Marlene wore. I had seen her in that exact coat at least 3 times. The footage wasn't conclusive. I couldn't prove beyond any doubt that it was Marlene. But the timing, the coat, the deliberate, methodical way the person moved along the fence, it was not random. I called Rebecca Townsend. I sent her the footage. Then I called Frank Dobbins. Then I called Patricia. Patricia said quietly but firmly, "Brian, that's trespassing and property tampering. That's not an HOA dispute anymore. That's a crime." She was right. I filed a police report. The officer who came to take the report was professional and thorough. He watched the footage twice, made copies, and asked me questions about the situation for about 40 minutes. He noted that the footage, while not conclusive, was relevant circumstantial evidence, and that the timing and context of the incident were significant given the ongoing HOA dispute. He also told me something I found very useful, that Marlene Chambers had previously had a noise complaint filed against a neighbor, and that in the course of that investigation, there had been a documented incident of Marlene reportedly damaging a neighbor's property, a garden ornament that had been accidentally broken during what Marlene described as a property boundary dispute. The complaint had been closed without action at the time, but it was on file. This wasn't just a one-time impulse. This was a pattern. The police report was filed. The officer said he would follow up, which in my experience with police bureaucracy usually means somewhere between immediately and never, but to his credit, he actually followed up within 2 days. He spoke to Marlene directly. She denied any involvement. She said she had been home all afternoon on the day in question. The officer then, very politely and very professionally, mentioned that it might be possible to corroborate her presence at home through, say, her own doorbell camera footage. Marlene said she would look into it. 2 days later, Marlene produced footage from her own front door camera that, she claimed, showed her car in her driveway all afternoon. But here's the thing about that. Being home in the morning doesn't mean you were home all afternoon. Your car being in the driveway means your car was in the driveway, and the footage she produced had a visible timestamp gap of about 45 minutes right around 2 p.m., a gap her attorney explained as a camera glitch. A camera glitch. Right around the time someone was at my property. The investigating officer noted all of this in his report. He also went back and looked at traffic camera footage from the intersection at the neighborhood entrance, which he'd requested as part of the investigation. The traffic camera footage showed a white Lexus SUV exiting the neighborhood at 1:51 p.m. and returning at 2:38 p.m. on the day in question. Marlene drove a white Lexus SUV. At that point, the nature of the police investigation changed. What had started as a trespassing and property tampering report was now looking considerably more serious, because Marlene had provided what appeared to be false or misleading information to a police officer during an investigation, and the traffic camera footage directly contradicted her alibi. Our attorney was kept in the loop throughout. Rebecca immediately filed a motion in the civil case, notifying the court of the criminal investigation and the new evidence. She argued that this demonstrated a pattern of retaliatory conduct by the HOA leadership that was directly relevant to the injunction proceedings. The judge was not pleased when she received this motion. She issued a written order requiring the HOA board to show cause as to why the injunction shouldn't be expanded to cover all enforcement activity related to the snow fence rule, not just liens, but fines, notices, and any other actions. Around this time, the Lakewood Community Management Company got very quietly uncomfortable. They sent a representative to meet with the HOA board, without Marlene, which apparently caused quite a scene when Marlene found out she'd been excluded. The Lakewood rep's message to the board was essentially that the company did not want to be associated with a board that was under criminal investigation, and that they were reviewing whether to continue their management contract. This was real pressure from an unexpected direction. Lakewood had been the administrative backbone of the HOA for years. The board without Lakewood would be scrambling to handle all the management functions themselves, which they were not equipped to do. Gary Schultz, our insider on the board, reported back to us that the atmosphere at the next board meeting had been notably tense. 3 of the 4 board members who had voted for the snow fence ban were now openly questioning whether the whole thing had been worth it. One of them, a man named Rick Holloway, had apparently told Marlene directly that he felt they'd been misled about the robustness of the legal footing for the rule. Marlene had reportedly told Rick to trust the process. Rick did not appear to trust the process much after that meeting. The week before the full hearing scheduled in district court, 2 things happened in quick succession. First, the Hennepin County DA's office announced that Marlene Chambers had been charged with misdemeanor trespassing and making a false statement to law enforcement in connection with the snow fence tampering incident. The traffic camera footage, her demonstrably false alibi, and the physical evidence from my property had been enough for the DA to move forward. It wasn't a felony, but it was a real criminal charge. She would have to appear in court. She would have a record if convicted. Second, 3 of the 4 board members who had voted for the snow fence ban sent a joint letter to the Hennepin County Court and to all Pinecrest Meadows homeowners formally withdrawing their support for the snow fence rule and requesting that it be rescinded. The letter cited procedural irregularities in the adoption of the rule and new information that has come to light regarding the rule's impact on homeowners. Reading between the lines, they were cutting bait. They did not want to be in a courtroom sitting next to Marlene Chambers while the full story of how this had gone down was laid out for a judge. Marlene was publicly furious. She sent a mass email to the HOA listserv, which everyone in the neighborhood received, accusing the 3 board members of betrayal and cowardice, and accusing a small group of homeowners of conducting a coordinated campaign to undermine the board's authority. She was not subtle about who she meant. She called out Frank Dobbins by name. She stopped just short of calling out me and Patricia, though she referenced the homeowner on Birchwood who has retained outside legal counsel, which, given that I was the only one who had retained outside legal counsel, was pretty clear. The email was a spectacular miscalculation. The homeowners who had been mostly uninvolved in the dispute, people who hadn't received fence violation letters and had been watching from the sidelines, read that email and formed strong opinions. Not opinions favorable to Marlene. The email came across as angry, entitled, accusatory, and totally disconnected from the fact that what had actually happened was that Marlene had apparently gone onto a neighbor's property and tampered with their fence while being the subject of an active injunction. Her framing of herself as the victim was not landing. Within 24 hours of that email, my group text had expanded from 8 people to 29. People were now reaching out asking how they could help, what they could sign, whether there was a meeting being organized. We organized a meeting. We held it at the Pinecrest Meadows community room, which was technically HOA-controlled space, but which Gary Schultz, as a board member, opened for us. 31 homeowners showed up on a Tuesday night, which was roughly half the households in the neighborhood. Given that it was February and getting to the community room required walking on icy sidewalks, that was an extraordinary turnout. People brought hot drinks. Someone brought a slow cooker full of chili. It had the atmosphere of a campaign rally crossed with a church potluck. Patricia and I laid out the full timeline. The passing of the rule without proper notice, the violation letters, the fines, the lien threats, the injunction, the fence tampering, the police investigation, and now the criminal charges. We also laid out what we were asking for: the snow fence rule to be formally rescinded, all fines and fees voided, and a full audit of the board's practices over the past 3 years, including meeting notices, voting procedures, and fine enforcement records. The room was with us. Unanimously, as far as I could tell. Gary Schultz spoke briefly, and he was more forceful than I'd expected from the quiet man I'd met at the gas station. He said that the board had strayed, under certain leadership, from its actual purpose, which was to serve the community, and that he intended to see it corrected. He got genuine applause. We circulated a formal petition, citing the procedural defects and requesting an emergency general homeowner meeting where a vote could be held on rescinding the snow fence rule and conducting a board audit. Under the CC and RS, a petition signed by 30% of homeowners could compel such a meeting. We had way more than 30% in that room alone. The petition was submitted the following morning to Lakewood Community Management and to every board member by certified mail. Marlene's response to the petition was to send another email, this one shorter but equally combative, essentially arguing that the homeowners didn't understand the big picture and that she was acting in the community's best interests. The email contained no acknowledgement of the criminal charges against her, no acknowledgement of the tampered fence, and no acknowledgement of the procedural defects that a district court had already found credible enough to issue an injunction over. She was, to use a technical term, in full denial mode. At the compelled general meeting, which was held about 2 weeks later on a Saturday morning, with the snow still piled up in banks along every street, the attendance was 51 out of 62 households, record-breaking for Pinecrest Meadows, according to Gary, who had been attending these things for years. The meeting was run by Gary as the senior non-tainted board member, with Patricia observing as our group's representative to ensure proper procedure. The vote on rescinding the snow fence rule was 50-1. Marlene, who had attended, cast the one no vote. She looked, sitting in the front row in that gray wool coat with the navy stripe, like a person who was gradually understanding that the world she'd operated in for 6 years had shifted around her in a way she couldn't control. The vote on conducting a 3-year audit of HOA board practices was 49-2. 2 board members who had supported the snow fence ban voted against the audit, possibly because they were worried about what it might reveal, but they were vastly outnumbered. The vote on whether Marlene Chambers should resign from the board immediately was 47 in favor, 4 against, with Marlene herself abstaining. Abstaining was, I thought, a surprisingly self-aware move, but it didn't change the outcome. 47-4 was a clear expression of community will, and under the CC and RS, a 2/3 homeowner vote could remove a board member. 47 out of 51 present, roughly 92%, was well past 2/3. Marlene Chambers resigned from the Pinecrest Meadows HOA board that Saturday morning, effective immediately. She stood up, said one sentence, "I have served this community with integrity and I stand by my record," and then walked out of the community room into the cold February morning. The room was very quiet for about 3 seconds, and then several people started talking at once, and someone refilled the coffee, and the meeting moved on to the next agenda item. The full hearing in district court, which had been scheduled for 6 weeks out when the injunction was granted, ended up being moot in the most satisfying way possible. Because the board had formally rescinded the snow fence rule before the hearing date, and because they had issued written confirmation that all fines and fees assessed under the rule were voided, there was nothing for the court to rule on. Rebecca filed a notice of voluntary resolution, the court closed the case, and we were done. Except for the criminal case against Marlene, which proceeded separately on its own timeline. I don't want to overstate what happened there, because it's important to be accurate. Marlene was charged with misdemeanor trespassing and misdemeanor obstruction for the false alibi statement. She did not go to jail. She was not marched out in handcuffs on national television. What happened was that she entered a plea agreement, pleaded guilty to the trespassing charge. The obstruction charge was dropped as part of the agreement, and she received a sentence of a fine and 18 months of probation. She was also required to pay me restitution for the cost of repairing the snow fence stakes that had been damaged, which came to just under $200. It wasn't a dramatic courtroom moment, but it was accountability. Real, legal, documented accountability. Her name was in the court record. The circumstances were on file. And if anything like this ever happened again in any context, it would be part of her history. The HOA's 3-year audit, conducted by an independent accounting and governance firm that the board hired with community approval, turned out to be illuminating. The firm found several instances over the prior 3 years where fines had been assessed without proper documentation or procedure. Instances where meeting minutes had been altered after the fact to correct or smooth over procedural irregularities, and one situation where funds allocated for a community landscaping project had been redirected to a different project without homeowner vote, which the CC and RS required. The amount was not enormous, around $4,000, but it had been handled without transparency or authorization. None of these findings rose to the level of criminal fraud, in the auditor's opinion, though they referred the question to an attorney to review. The attorney concluded that the financial redirection, while improper under the CC and RS, probably didn't constitute theft given the money had been spent on a legitimate community expense, just not the one it had been allocated for. The recommended remedy was better financial controls going forward and a formal acknowledgement in the HOA records of the improper redirection. But the pattern it revealed mattered. The board under Marlene's leadership had operated with minimal transparency, minimal procedural rigor, and an apparent assumption that the homeowners either didn't know their rights or wouldn't bother to assert them. For a long time, that assumption had been correct. It wasn't correct anymore. By March, the snow was still on the ground but starting to recede around the edges in that tentative way it does in Minnesota when spring is 6 weeks off, but starting to signal its eventual arrival. The HOA elected 2 new board members to fill the seats vacated by Marlene and by Rick Holloway, who had resigned quietly about 2 weeks after the general meeting, apparently having decided that his association with the whole situation was no longer worth maintaining. The new board members were Patricia Olson, who ran specifically on a platform of procedural transparency, and actually won by a wide margin, and a retired high school principal named Thomas Garrett who lived at the curve on Maple Court and who had spent 20 years running school board meetings and knew how proper governance was supposed to work. The first thing the new board did at its first formal meeting was draft and distribute a new governance document, a plain-language summary of homeowner rights and board responsibilities, written in normal English without the legalese that had obscured so many of the original CC and R provisions from regular people who just wanted to know if they could put up a snow fence. The second thing they did was formally amend the aesthetic guidelines to include an explicit carve-out for temporary seasonal equipment, including but not limited to snow fences, holiday lighting, seasonal garden covers, and similar items. The carve-out was properly noticed to all homeowners 30 days in advance, was presented at a general meeting, and passed unanimously. My snow fence stood through the rest of the winter without incident. Frank's fence stood. Patricia's fence, which she had installed 2 days after the injunction was granted, and which was a particularly robust wooden slat model that she described as her statement piece, stood without a word from anyone. The winter of that year was one of the snowiest on record for our area. We had a storm in late February that dropped another 18 inches, and another in early March that caught everyone off guard with a foot on top of an existing 6-inch base. Every morning I looked out at my driveway and found it manageable because the fence was doing its job, directing the drift to the corner of the yard where it piled up harmlessly, and then melted into the drainage easement where it belonged. Across the street, the Petersons, who had removed their fence during the period when they were frightened by the fines, had reinstalled it as soon as the rule was rescinded. I helped them put it back up on a Saturday afternoon, a 30-minute job with 2 people and a cup of hot chocolate waiting back inside. Their newborn was 4 months old by then, and had developed the habit of staring at snowy windows with enormous, fascinated eyes, which his mother showed me a photograph of, and which was frankly the cutest thing I'd seen all winter. I ran into Marlene Chambers exactly once after everything concluded, at the gas station near the neighborhood entrance, of all places. The same gas station where I'd had my conversation with Gary Schultz. There was something almost poetic about it, though I suspect Minnesota gas stations in February are just a universal nexus for significant neighborhood encounters. She was on the opposite side of the pump island from me. We both noticed each other at the same moment. There was a silence, the kind that has a lot of things in it. I said, "Cold out, because what do you say?" She said, "Yes," and then she looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't fully read and said, "I did care about this neighborhood, Brian. I want you to know that." I thought about that for a second. I believed her in some version of it. I believed that she had genuinely cared about the neighborhood's appearance. I believed that she had genuinely thought snow fences looked industrial, and that she had genuinely been offended by them in whatever way people get offended by aesthetic things. I also believed that caring about something doesn't give you the right to run roughshod over your neighbor's practical needs, fabricate alibis to investigators, or trespass on private property in a blizzard. "I know," I said, "but you had a funny way of showing it." She nodded once, got in her Lexus, and drove away. I filled my tank, went home, and made dinner. The spring came, eventually, the way it always does in Minnesota after you've started to wonder if you actually just live in a frozen tundra now, and the whole four seasons thing was a myth. The snow fences came down in April, stored neatly in garages and sheds and the corner of Frank's basement where he kept his winter equipment. The streets dried out, the birds reappeared, and the neighborhood looked exactly the way it always had. Regular, middling nice suburban Minnesota. Not industrial, not a construction zone. Just a neighborhood where 62 families lived their lives and occasionally shoveled each other out of snowbanks. The HOA still existed, because HOAs do not cease to exist, they just change character. Under Patricia and Thomas's guidance, the board held monthly open meetings that were actually noticed properly, actually welcomed attendance, and actually published minutes within a week of each meeting. Fine enforcement went through a documented process with multiple steps and appeal options. The aesthetic guidelines were simplified and clarified so that people could actually understand what they were agreeing to. Not everyone was happy with every decision the new board made. That's how it goes. But the decisions were made transparently, with proper procedure, and with the community's actual interests as the primary consideration rather than any one person's personal aesthetic preferences. Frank Dobbins told me at a neighborhood cookout that first summer, standing in his backyard with a can of beer, looking genuinely relaxed for the first time since I'd known him, that he'd lived in Pinecrest Meadows for 12 years, and this was the first summer in 6 that he wasn't dreading the HOA letter that showed up every season with some new complaint about his property. "It's amazing," he said, "how much mental bandwidth that frees up." I laughed and agreed, and thought about that cream-colored envelope sitting on my kitchen table in January, in the cold at 7 degrees, while the worst cold snap in 11 years pressed against the windows. I thought about reading that letter and thinking someone was joking, and finding out they weren't, and deciding right then that I wasn't going to just comply and hope it went away. It would have been so much easier to comply. Remove the fence, pay the fine eventually, absorb the cost and the inconvenience, go back to shoveling 4-foot drifts out of my driveway every winter morning. That was clearly what Marlene was counting on. That was how the HOA had operated for years, through a combination of intimidation, procedural complexity, and the reasonable human tendency to avoid conflict when it seems expensive and exhausting. But sometimes the expensive and exhausting conflict is the one worth having. The snow fence stood all winter. My driveway was clear every morning. The HOA got reformed. A bad actor got held accountable by real courts and real law. My neighbors got organized, got informed, and got their community back. And somewhere in her house 4 doors down, Marlene Chambers was, I assumed, staring at the same neighborhood she'd always stared at, except now it wasn't her fiefdom. It was just a neighborhood. With snow fences, which it had been all along,